8 years of field medicine teach you one thing. When someone is bleeding to death, you don't think, you act. But Dan Reyes has just woken up in the Stone Age, and by saving this woman, he's made an enemy in a single minute. One who won't forgive him for this for 2 years. First comes the cold. A wet, heavy cold creeps under his skin and presses against his ribs. His face is pressed into something damp. Moss. It smells of earth, rot, and blood. Dan inhales and starts coughing. A sharp pain shoots through his chest, and his vision goes dark. He rolls onto his back. Above him hangs a sky the color of wet wool. A foreign sky. People are screaming from the side. Not words. High-pitched, jagged sounds he doesn't understand. Dan opens his eyes wider and sees people. Skins draped over their shoulders. Bare, dirty feet. Faces contorted with fear. A dozen people stand over him, staring as if a dead man had crawled out of the ground. He doesn't understand a thing. Where is he? How did he end up here? Why have these people stepped off the museum wall? But one thing he grasps immediately. 3 steps away, a young woman is dying on the ground. Blood spurts from the wound on her thigh in pulses that match the rhythm of her heartbeat. Arterial bleeding. The femoral artery. 3 minutes. Maybe 4. Then her heart will stop because there will be nothing left to pump. Nearby, on his knees, an old man dressed in feathers and animal skins is pouring ashes into the open wound. Ashes into a fresh wound. Everything inside Dan tightens, not out of anger, out of reflex. 8 years have drilled one thing into him. If she's bleeding out, act. He doesn't know where he is or who these people are. He doesn't know if he's even alive or if this is just the last flicker of his brain beneath a concrete slab. But the blood is real, and the woman is truly dying. Dan stands up. His legs won't hold him. His knees are shaking. He steps toward the woman, and the old man looks up at him. There's neither surprise nor fear in his eyes, just a cold warning. Don't come any closer. Dan steps closer. He grabs the old man by the shoulder and shoves him aside. The old man falls on his butt. Someone in the crowd cries out. Someone takes a step forward. Dan isn't looking at them anymore. He stares intently at the wound. Ragged, deep. The edge of the artery is torn. There's so much blood that the grass around it has turned black. He rips his shirt off. The fabric is dirty and wet, but he has no other shirt. He twists the strip into a tourniquet. He presses his fist into the spot just above the wound, right into the groin crease, and stops the flow. With one hand, he presses down. With the other, he ties the strip around the thigh. He doesn't have enough hands. A woman in her 30s stands frozen nearby, her face broad, her eyes wide with horror. Dan grabs her hand and presses it against his fist over the artery. He screams, in English, in Spanish, in any language. Hold it, tight, don't let go. She doesn't know the words, but she understands his hands. She understands the pressure. She squeezes. Dan ties off the thigh. The blood flow slows. He ties it off again, knot after knot. The blood stops. The woman on the ground is as white as milk. Her lips are gray. Her eyes roll back. But she's breathing. Her pulse is weak and rapid, but it's there. Dan sinks down beside her. His hands are shaking. His right hand is covered in blood up to the elbow. He lifts his head and meets 20 pairs of eyes. There's no gratitude in them. Not yet. There's wild animal shock in them, as if right before their eyes, lightning had struck a tree, and instead of burning, it had blossomed. And then he sees the old man. The old man has already gotten to his feet. Ash is falling from his skin, and he's looking at Dan, not as a miracle, not as a savior, as an enemy. That's how a man looks who has just lost something important and knows exactly who's to blame. Dan doesn't know a single word of their language yet. He doesn't know the old man's name. He doesn't know that this gaze will haunt him for the next 2 years. But a familiar feeling from the hot spots is already stirring in his stomach. You've just saved a life. And with a single move, you've made an enemy. They drag him into a hut, low and dark, with a dirt floor and smoke that stings his eyes. They throw him onto a bed of animal skins. They post 2 men at the entrance, not guards, watchmen. Dan lies in the darkness and listens. Voices, footsteps. A child is crying somewhere. Stone clattering against stone. He tries to make sense of it all. The last thing he remembers is the collapse. A concrete slab. A boy under the rubble. He pulls him by the hand. Then a second blow. Darkness. And now he's here, on the wet ground among people in animal skins. Either he's dead and this is a deathbed delirium, or he's in a coma in a military hospital. Or this is reality. And if it's reality, then he's fallen into a world without antibiotics, without anesthesia, without sterile instruments, no electricity. All he has left is his head. 12 years of practice, protocols drilled into his muscle memory, the knowledge that he must wash his hands, boil the water, that ash in a wound is a direct path to sepsis and death. Smoke creeps up the walls. Behind the hut, a woman whose bleeding he stopped is breathing. He can feel it. And another feeling lives alongside it, heavy and cold. The old man in feathers won't forget. People like that don't forgive. In the morning, they come for him. 2 of them gesture for him to go outside. Dan steps out and sees for the first time where he's ended up. A valley, wide and green, nestled between 3 mountain ranges. Below, the river glistens like a strip of tin. Dozens of huts line the bank. Smoke rises from each one. Women carry clay pots on their heads. Naked children run about between the houses. Dogs bark. Sheep graze. A lively settlement. And everything screams one thing. This is the late Neolithic. Stone tools, clay without a potter's wheel, hides instead of cloth, not a single piece of metal. No, just one. An old man wearing feathers has a knife hanging from his belt. Copper, tarnished. The only metal in the entire settlement. Dan is led to a large hut in the center. Inside sits a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with a stern face and a gaze that makes you want to look away. A necklace of fangs around his neck, scars on his hands. The chief. Dan understands this without words, from the way everyone around him moves, from the way the air thickens when this man raises his head. The old man with feathers sits nearby, that same cold, calculating gaze. The chief utters a long phrase of incomprehensible sounds, then another. The old man throws out something sharp and short. The chief points a finger at Dan, then at the door. Dan understands. They're asking him who he is, where he's from, and what he did to their woman. He has no way to answer. Not a single word in their language. He does the only thing he can. He raises his open, empty palms. He presses his hand to his chest. He points toward the hut where the wounded woman lies, and he places 2 fingers on his wrist. A pulse. She's alive. I helped her. The chief holds his gaze for a long time. Then he turns to the old man. The old man utters a word. The chief nods. They lead Dan away. They don't kill him, they don't chase him away, but they don't accept him either. They put him in a tiny hut on the very edge, next to the sheep pen. It's a message. You're not one of us. You're somewhere between a human and an animal. We'll see. Dan sits down on the floor. He looks at his hands. The woman's blood is still under his fingernails. He has nothing. No food, no tools, no language, no allies, no plan. Just a head filled with everything he knows about how to keep people from dying. And his hands. Dirty, blood-stained hands, which, for starters, need to be washed. For the first 3 days, Dan counted. He counted the huts, 42. He counted the people, about 200. He counted the children, few. Too few for a settlement of this size. He counted the women with big bellies, 4. He counted the graves on the hillside across the river, many. Too many fresh ones. He counted everything because he could count without a language. They brought him food twice a day, flatbreads made from something resembling barley, a piece of boiled meat, water in a clay bowl. He didn't know who had ordered that he be fed. Most likely the chief, or that woman with the broad face who had helped him apply pressure to his artery. She came every day. She stood at the entrance to his hut and watched. She didn't say anything. She just watched. On the 3rd day, she brought a boy of about 6 with her. The boy was bolder. He came inside. He touched Dan's hand. He touched his hair. He laughed. He pointed at himself and said a word. Then he pointed at Dan and waited. Dan understood. A name. The boy was saying his name. Dan repeated it. The boy laughed again. He pointed at the fire. He said a word. He pointed at the water. He said a word. He pointed at the rock. That's how it began. The children became his teachers. They came in groups of 3 or 4. They crouched around him and pointed at everything in sight. Rock, water, fire, hand, leg, eye, mouth, eat, drink, sleep. Every day, Dan learned 20 words. He scratched them into the dirt floor with a stick. He drew a picture next to each one. After a week, he knew more than 100 words. That wasn't enough to have a conversation, but it was enough for what mattered most. He could say, "It hurts." He could say, "Water." He could say, "Clean." He could say, "Hands." On the 5th day, he went to the river. 2 guards followed him. They didn't interfere, but they didn't stray far either. Dan washed his hands, longing and thoroughly, scrubbing them with sand from the riverbed. Then he scooped up water in a bowl he'd snatched from his hut. He returned. He built a fire. He placed 3 stones in the fire. When the stones were red hot, he threw them into the water. The water hissed and began to boil. The guards watched this without interest. Boiling water was nothing new to them. They boiled water for herbal teas, but they didn't understand why. Dan waited for the water to cool. Then he washed her hands again. Then he went to the hut where the woman he had saved was lying. They wouldn't let him in. A young man stood at the entrance with a stone axe slung over his shoulder. Her husband, or her brother. He said something sharp and stood in the doorway. Dan pointed to his clean hands. He pointed to the hut. He said the only word he knew that made sense here. Help. The man didn't budge. The woman with the broad face came out of the hut. She looked at Dan. She looked at the man with the axe. She said something to him. He reluctantly stepped aside. Dan went inside. The woman was lying on animal skins, pale, weak, but alive. The bandage on her thigh was soaked with blood and dirt. It hadn't been changed. Dan crouched down beside her. Carefully, he unwrapped the rags. The wound was inflamed. There was redness and swelling all around it. An infection was setting in. He had no antibiotics. He had nothing but boiled water and the knowledge that the wound needed to be cleaned. He cleaned it, slowly, carefully. The woman clenched her teeth but didn't scream. She watched his hands, the way he worked. at how gently he touched her skin. She'd seen his hands 5 days ago when they were covered in blood and moved as swiftly as water over a rapids. Now they moved slowly, gently. When he finished, he tore the piece of hide which the woman with the broad face had brought him into strips. He boiled the strips in hot water. He waited. He applied a clean bandage. That was all he could do. The rest depended on the wounded woman's body and how deep the infection had gone. He came every day, changed the bandage, rinsed the wound with boiled water. On the 3rd day, the redness began to fade. On the 5th day, the woman sat up on her own. On the 7th, she spoke to him. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was thanking him. And the old man in feathers had been watching all this time. His name was Kavarin. Dan learned this name from the children. They whispered it and looked around. Kavarin, Tenyu, the one who speaks with smoke. High priest of the Grey Heron tribe, 30 years in power. For 30 years, he had been the only one standing between the people and death. The only one who spoke with the Nameless One. The only one who decided whom to heal and whom to leave to die. And now a stranger had arrived. A naked, filthy stranger with no language and no name. And in 4 minutes, he did what Kavarin had been unable to do in 30 years. Dan saw him every day. Kavarin sat by the large hearth in the center of the settlement. There were always people around him. He dispensed herbal concoctions. He read the cracks in a deer's shoulder blade. He whispered incantations over sick children. He did nothing wrong. But every time Dan walked by, Kavarin would look up and stare at him. And every time, Dan could feel that gaze on the back of his neck for another half hour afterward. On the 10th day, what Dan had been waiting for and dreading happened. A woman came to his hut, a young woman, about 20 years old, with a huge belly. She was holding onto the wall and breathing rapidly and shallowly. Another woman walked beside her, older, with dark hands scarred from burns, a midwife. Dan knew it from her hands, from the way she supported the pregnant woman, from the way she looked at her belly, a professional gaze, assessing. The midwife spoke, quickly and tensely. Dan didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Something was wrong. Something was going wrong with the labor, and she didn't know what to do, so she'd come to him because there was no one else. Dan placed his hand on the pregnant woman's belly, gently. Through the thin skin, he could feel the baby, the position, transverse. The baby was lying on its side. If it wasn't turned, it wouldn't come out. The mother would die. The baby will die. The midwife knew that. That's why she came. Dan looked at her. He looked at the pregnant woman. 7 months, maybe 8. Too early, way too early. And a transverse presentation. And he was alone. No anesthesia, no instruments, with boiling water and his bare hands. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. Then he said 2 words to the midwife, the only ones he knew. Water, fire. She understood. 10 minutes later, there were 3 pots of boiling water standing in the hut. Dan washed his hands, up to his elbows, with ash and boiling water. The midwife watched him. He gestured to her. My hands, like this. She didn't move. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not fear, not anger, something else. He would later realize what it was. But right now, there was no time for that. He gestured to her again. My hands. She slowly walked over to the pot. She dipped her hands into the warm, boiled water. She rubbed them with ash. Dan nodded. Then he turned to the pregnant woman. She was lying on the animal skins. Her eyes were wide open. She was scared. Dan put his hand on her shoulder. He looked into her eyes. He couldn't tell her that everything would be all right. He didn't know those words. And he didn't know if everything would be all right. But he could look her in the eyes and not look away. He began. An external version, a technique an old military doctor had taught him in Helmand province. With both hands across her belly, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the woman was screaming. The midwife held her by the shoulders. Dan could feel the small body beneath his hands, a body that didn't want to turn, a stubborn little body. He pressed, gently but persistently. 20 minutes, 30. Sweat streamed into his eyes. His hands trembled with tension. And then he felt the baby turn. Head down, feet up. The correct position. Dan exhaled. Then the delivery began. It lasted an hour, a difficult, agonizing hour. But the baby was coming out the right way, head first. Dan was delivering her. The midwife helped. They didn't understand each other's words, but they understood each other's gestures. The baby girl was born blue. She wasn't breathing. Dan took her. She was tiny. She fit in the palm of his hand. He sucked the mucus out with his mouth. He turned her over. He tapped her heels. Nothing. He began massaging her chest with 2 fingers, quick, light presses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He blew air into her mouth. A tiny breath. Another round of chest compressions. Another breath. The midwife stood nearby, holding her own breath. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The baby girl cried out. A thin, hoarse, angry cry. The most beautiful sound Dan had ever heard in his life. He placed the girl on her mother's chest. The mother was crying. The midwife looked at her hands, at her clean hands, and on her face was an expression that Dan now understood. It was a question. A huge, terrifying question she was afraid to ask. If all it took was clean hands, if that was all there was to it, what had I been doing all these years? And how many of those I'd lost might still be alive? Dan saw that question in her eyes, and his throat tightened. He knew the answer, and that answer was cruel. But he didn't say it. Not now. Later. 4 days after giving birth, the mother got up and went to the river. On her own. Without help. Without a fever. Without chills. She simply got up and went. By all the signs of this world, she should have been lying down. By all the customs, she was not supposed to leave the hut for 9 days. By all of Kvarana's expectations, she was supposed to die on the 4th day. Because that's how everyone died. The 4th day. The 5th. A fever. Heat. Shivering. Then silence. The nameless woman would draw her last breath, and the midwife would wrap her body in burial hides. But this woman was walking along the path toward the river, carrying her daughter in her arms, who was screaming so loudly that the sheep scattered. The tribe was silent. Dan stood by his hut and watched. Nari stood beside him. She too was silent, but her silence was different. It was heavy. Dan already knew her name. Nari, the chief midwife of the Gray Heron tribe, 26 years old, a widow, 2 children. She had been delivering babies for 10 years. 40 women had died in her arms over the years. 40. She remembered each one by name. Dan learned this later. And now she stood nearby, watching as the young mother walked toward the river, alive and well. And she was so silent that the air around her seemed to ring. That evening she came to his hut, alone, without a pregnant woman, without a sick person, without a reason. She just came. She sat down on the floor across from him. She looked him in the eyes and asked. By then, Dan already knew about 300 words. That was enough to understand the question. You're saying I killed them? That's what she asked. Not in those words, but that was the meaning. Dan looked at her for a long time, at her hands scarred from burns, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the tight line of her lips. For 10 years, this woman had gone into the birthing huts and done everything she knew how, and the women died. And she thought it was the Nameless One, that it was fate, that it was the will of the spirits which could not be changed. And now a stranger had come. He'd washed his hands, and the woman had survived. Dan answered slowly, choosing his words carefully. No, you didn't kill her. You weren't taught. No one taught you. Now I'll teach you. Nari sat motionless. Then she stood up. She walked out of the hut. Dan heard her walking along the path. He couldn't tell if she was crying, but he knew. The next day she came back. She sat down across from him and said one word. Teach me. From that day on, Nari became his first student. She was the best student he'd ever had, because he didn't need to explain why. She knew why. The 40 names in her head told her why every night. Dan started with the simplest thing, hands. He taught her to wash her hands with ashes and boiled water, before childbirth, after childbirth, before touching a wound, after touching a wound. Always. She remembered everything the first time. Then the instruments. Everything that touches the body must be clean. The knife used to cut the umbilical cord, the thread used to stitch up tears, the animal hides on which the woman in labor is laid. Everything must be boiled. Everything must be scorched over a fire. Nari listened and nodded. Then water. The woman in labor drinks only boiled water. Wounds are washed only with boiled water. No water from the river, no water from a stagnant puddle. Then came the hardest part. Dan tried to explain to her why. Why boiled water? Why clean hands? Why dirt kills? He couldn't tell her about bacteria. He didn't have the word for it. He didn't have a concept she could understand. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he found it. He told her that very small, evil spirits live in the dirt. So small that you can't see them with the naked eye. They live in the ground, in dirty water, and on dirty hands. When they get into a wound or into a woman's body after childbirth, they start eating the flesh from the inside. Hot water kills them. Ash kills them. Fire kills them. Purity kills them. He expected Nari to look at him as if he were crazy. She didn't. She nodded, calmly and seriously. Because in a world where there is the Nameless One, Fire Father, and the progenitor river, the idea of tiny, invisible spirits living in the dirt wasn't madness. It made sense. It explained what Hwaran hadn't been able to explain in 30 years. Why women die after giving birth. Not because the Nameless One is angry, but because little evil spirits get inside through dirty hands. Nari understood this in a single minute, and that 1 minute was worth more than all the surgeries Dan had performed up to that point. Because surgeries save one person, but understanding saves everyone who comes after. Meanwhile, the chief of the Grey Heron tribe began to take a closer look at Dan. His name was Kelhan. Dan learned this name during the 2nd week. Kelhan, the chief, 42 years old. He had lost 2 wives to childbed fever. He had lost a sister. He had 1 wife and 1 son left. For the chief of the valley's largest tribe, this was a catastrophe. Without heirs, there is no future. Without wives, there are no heirs. Without midwives who know how to save lives, there are no wives. Kelhan was no fool. He saw that the stranger had saved a woman with a torn hip. He saw that the stranger had delivered a baby in a birth the midwife had deemed hopeless. He saw that the mother was back on her feet by the 4th day. He didn't understand how, but he understood what had happened, and he understood the price. By the third week, Kelhan came to Dan's hut on his own, without guards. He sat across from him. He was silent for a long time. Then he spoke. Dan didn't understand everything, but he understood the main point. Kelhan said that women were dying, that they die every rainy season, that he had lost 2 wives, that neighboring tribes were losing even more, that if this continued, in 10 winters, there would be no mothers left in the valley, no children left, no tribes left. He didn't ask for help. Chiefs don't ask. He was simply stating a fact. But Dan heard between the lines what wasn't said. "Help me. You can. I've seen it." Dan replied, slowly and carefully, choosing each word from his 300. He said he could help, but he needed a place, a separate hut for the sick, so that the nameless one wouldn't walk among the healthy. He said it exactly like that, not because he believed in the nameless one, but because Kelhan believed. And quarantine, disguised as a ritual, was the only way that could work. Kelhan looked at him. Dan could see the gears turning in the chief's mind. The stranger is asking for a hut. The stranger is talking about the nameless one. Havaran says the stranger is a demon, but his wives are dead. His sister is dead. And the woman the stranger healed walks to the river on her own. Kelhan nodded. The next day, 5 men began building a new hut, larger than usual, set apart from the others, further down the slope. Dan chose the spot himself, downstream from the water source, upstream from the livestock pens, away from the latrine. Hawaran watched the construction from the large hearth. He didn't say a word. He didn't object. He didn't go to the chief. He just watched. And that silence frightened Dan more than any words could. Huaran was thinking. Huaran was planning. Huaran was waiting. 2 days later, the hut was ready. Dan named it to himself in English, Quarantine Unit. Out loud, he named it in the tribe's language, Hut of Clean Hands. Nari helped him set it up inside. Beds made of fresh hides, pots for boiling water, a separate hearth, a supply of ash for washing. They worked all day. By evening, everything was ready. Dan stood in the doorway and looked at his first hospital. A dirt floor, a leaky roof, the smell of smoke and damp hides. 4 sleeping platforms, 3 pots, 1 hearth. In any other world, it would have been a hut. Here, it was the beginning. Dan received a name toward the end of the 4th week. They found him by the river. He had come out of the water. That meant the river mother had sent him. Or spat him out. The tribe couldn't decide which was correct, but they gave him a name. Tan He, he who came from the water. Dan accepted the name without argument. He didn't care what his name was, but he did care that they had started calling him by a name, because that name meant one simple thing. He was no longer just livestock in the pen. He was someone. Not yet a human in the full sense of the word as they understood it, but already someone with a name. That was important. Because at the end of the 4th week, the rainy season began, and with it came death. The first woman in labor was brought to the Hut of Clean Hands on the 3rd day of the rains, a young girl, about 16 years old, her first childbirth. Dan and Nari worked together, clean hands, boiled water, clean skins on the cot. The delivery was difficult, but without complications. A boy, healthy. He cried so loudly you couldn't hear the rain. By the 4th day, the mother was back on her feet, no fever. The second woman was brought in a week later, then the 3rd, then the 4th. The rainy season in the Valley of the 3 Mothers lasted 3 months. During those 3 months, 7 women gave birth in the Hut of Clean Hands. 7. All 7 survived. All 7 babies survived. Not a single case of fever. Not a single one. Nari kept track, with notches on the post by the entrance. Each notch was a life. 7 notches. Last rainy season, out of 9 women who gave birth in the Grey Heron tribe, 4 died. 4 out of 9. Almost half. This season, 0 out of 7. 0. Dan looked at those notches and thought they were the best statistics of his life. Better than in any field hospital. Better than in any humanitarian mission. Because here, the baseline was so low that simply washing one's hands yielded results that, in the modern world, would have earned a Nobel Prize. But he didn't celebrate, because in neighboring tribes, women continued to die. Every week he heard reports. She died there. She died there. She gave birth to a stillborn there. Hwaran heard them too, and Hwaran took action. Dan found out about it by chance. In the second month of the rainy season, a group of 3 people arrived at the settlement. 2 men and a woman, from the White Owl tribe. A 2-day journey to the north. The woman was pregnant, 8 months along. Her husband had heard that the Grey Heron had a man who saved women in labor. They came to ask for help. They were turned away. Dan found out about it a day later, from the boy who brought him water. The boy said that people from another tribe had come, that Hwaran had spoken with them at the gate and that they had left. Dan went to Kelkan. He asked. Kelkan frowned. He didn't know. Hwaran hadn't reported it to him. Hwaran had decided on his own. Kelhan sent a hunter after them. The hunter returned a day later, alone. The people from the White Owl had left. A woman had given birth on the way. The child survived. The mother did not. Dan sat in his hut and stared at his hands. He could have saved her. He could have, if he'd known, if they'd called him, if Hwaran hadn't intercepted them at the gate. Nari came in the evening. She saw the look on his face. She didn't ask any questions. She just sat down beside him. They were silent for a long time. Then Dan said, I can't be everywhere. One person can't be everywhere. I need more hands, more people who know. Nari nodded. Then she said the thing that changed everything. She has a sister in the Black Otter tribe, a midwife too. She can teach her. Dan looked at her. Then he thought. Then he nodded. If one Nari saved 7 women in labor in a single season in one tribe, then 10 Naris in 10 tribes would save 70, 100. It was an idea worth more than any operation. Not to treat them yourself, to teach those who would treat them. But first, he had to resolve the issue with Quran. Because Quran hadn't just intercepted people at the gates. He'd sent messengers. Dan had learned this from Yuna. Yuna, the daughter of Chief Kelhan, 17 years old. She stuck her nose into everything she wasn't invited to. She asked questions that made adults' eyes glaze over. She came to Dan in the 6th week. She just showed up at the door of the hut of clean hands. She looked around. She touched the pots. She sniffed the ashes. She asked why he was washing his hands. Dan explained about the little evil spirits. Yuna listened. Then she asked, why can't we see them? Because they're very small. How small? Smaller than a grain of sand. What if you look really close? You still won't see them. What if through water? What if you look through a drop of water? Water makes things look bigger. I've seen it. Fish in water look bigger than they really are. Dan froze. He looked at this 17-year-old girl in furs who had just come up with the idea of a lens. No one had ever told her about microscopes. She had never seen glass. But she had observed fish in water, and she had drawn a conclusion. That conclusion was the scientific method in its purest form. Observation, hypothesis, verification. Dan told her she was smarter than anyone he'd ever known. Yuna didn't understand the compliment. She was just waiting for an answer to her question. He said yes. If you find the right drop of water or the right stone through which light passes in a special way, you can see it. And he'd try to do it. Yuna nodded. She wrote something down on a wooden tablet. Dan asked what she was writing. Yuna showed him. Scratches on the wood. Symbols. Similar to drawings, but not quite drawings. She had devised her own system of writing, all by herself, without anyone's help. Dan sat down on the floor and stared at the tablet for a long time. Then he looked at Yuna. This girl was a treasure, a diamond that this world didn't even know it possessed. She was being prepared to become the wife of the chieftain of a neighboring tribe, a political alliance. She was supposed to bear children and keep quiet, but she was inventing a writing system. Yuna became his second student, not a midwife, something else. She was his interpreter, his eyes and ears. And it was she who told him about Quran's messengers. Quran had sent men to the 4 neighboring tribes. He told the 10 of those tribes that a demon in human form had come to the Gray Heron, that he was stealing the spirit's work, that he had turned the Mother River away from the tribe, that as long as he lived, the spirits would be angry with the entire valley. Yuna had heard this herself. She had been hiding behind Quran's hut, listening as he spoke with the messenger from the Redstone tribe. She came and told Dan everything, calmly, without fear, as if she were reporting at a staff meeting. Dan listened. Then he asked, "Aren't you afraid he'll find out you were eavesdropping?" Yuna looked at him. She lifted her chin and said, "He's an old man. He can't see what's behind him. I can." Dan smiled. It was the first time in a month. Then the smirk faded, because the situation was serious. Quran was forming an alliance against him, not against the tribe, against him personally. If the 10 of 4 or 5 tribes unite and demand his extradition, Kelhan might not be able to hold out. The chieftain is strong, but one tribe alone cannot stand against 5. Dan had to act, but not as a warrior, as a healer. He told Nari it was time for her to go to her sister. Nari packed up in half a day. She took a small bag of ashes with her, a pot, strips of clean leather for bandages, and the knowledge in her head that was worth more than all the bronze weapons in the valley. She left at dawn. A hunter chosen by Kelhan went with her. Dan stood at the gate and watched her walk away along the path by the river, a small figure with a sack on her shoulders. The first healer he had trained, the first link in a chain that was meant to stretch across the entire valley, if Hwaran didn't break it. Nari left, taking half of Dan's peace of mind with her. He hadn't realized how used to her he'd become, to her quiet presence, to the way she handed him instruments before he even had a chance to ask, to the way she stood by his side during deliveries, knowing that if he missed something, she would see it. Now he was alone. Yuna was helping, but Yuna wasn't a midwife. She was the eyes, ears, and brain, but not the hands. Her hands didn't yet know how to receive a baby, how to apply pressure to a bleeding vessel, how to stitch up a tear. That only came with practice, and practice in this world meant someone's life hanging in the balance. The first week after Nari left was quiet. The rain poured down relentlessly. The river rose. The trails were washed out. The tribe stayed in their huts. Dan used the time wisely. He worked with Yuna on the language. By this point, he knew about 500 words and could form simple sentences. Yuna taught him not only words, but also the rules. What could be said to the chief? What could not be said in the presence of women? Which words were considered sacred and could only be spoken by the 10 Which gestures signified respect? Which were insults? Dan memorized everything. In the field, cultural protocol saves lives just as effectively as medicine. He knew this from Afghanistan, from Somalia, from dozens of places where a single wrong gesture meant a bullet in the back. There were no bullets here, but a stone axe did the job just as well. In the second week, Hae-young arrived. Dan didn't know who she was. He saw a tall woman with a broken nose that had healed crookedly. She moved like a hunter. Every step was precise. Every turn of her head was controlled. She hadn't come alone. On her back, she was carrying a girl of about 14. The girl was unconscious. Her right side was torn open, 3 parallel gashes. A wolf. Or a feral dog. Her muscles were visible. The blood was no longer flowing in a stream, but the wound was dirty. Dirt, grass, fur, all inside the wound. Haeun laid the girl down on a cot in the hut of clean hands. She looked at Dan and said one word. Save her. Dan didn't ask who they were. He didn't ask where they were from. That came later. Right now, there was the wound. He washed his hands, boiled some water, rinsed the wound, long and thoroughly. He picked out every bit of dirt, every blade of grass, every single hair. The girl regained consciousness halfway through the process and screamed. Haeun pressed her down onto the cot, not roughly, firmly, like someone who knows that pain is the price of life. Dan stitched up the wound with a live bone needle, 32 stitches. Each time the needle pierced living flesh. No anesthesia, no pain relief. Only Haeun's voice telling the girl something in a language Dan didn't know. Not the Grey Heron dialect. Another one. Similar, but different. When he finished and applied a clean bandage made of boiled strips of leather, the girl lost consciousness again. From the pain and from blood loss. But she was breathing steadily. Her pulse was stable. She would live. If the infection didn't get the better of her. If the spirits of filth, as Nari called them, didn't seep in through the 36 needle holes. Haeun stood over her sister. By then, Dan had already realized it was her sister. From the way she looked at her. From the way her hands trembled even though the rest of her body was motionless. Only her hands. She turned toward him and said something long. Dan didn't understand half of it, but Yuna was standing in the doorway. Yuna translated. Haeun was from the Black Otter tribe. She was a warrior, the only woman in her tribe's combat guard. Her tenyu had sent her here, not to bring her sister back. She'd picked up her sister along the way. She'd been sent to kill Dan. Yuna said this calmly, as if it were a fact. Dan looked at Haeyoung. Haeyoung looked at him. A long, steady gaze. Then she looked at her sister, who was breathing evenly and quietly beneath a clean bandage. Then back at Dan. She wasn't going to kill him. That much was obvious. But what she intended to do next was unclear. Dan sat down on the floor next to the cot. He was tired. 32 stitches without anesthesia drained the doctor's strength almost as much as it did the patient's. He told Yuna to translate. Your sister will live. I need to change the bandage every day. If you want, you can stay. If you want to kill me, wait until I finish treating her. Yuna translated. Haeyoung snorted. It was a sound so much like laughter that Dan was surprised. She said something brief. Yuna translated. She said you're strange for a demon. Dan smirked. Haeyoung stayed. She didn't say she wouldn't carry out the task. She didn't say she changed her mind. She just stayed. She slept at the threshold of the hut where her sister lay. She ate what they brought to Dan. Every day she watched as he changed the bandage, as he washed the wound, as he checked for a fever. On the 3rd day, she helped him hold the girl when she flinched from the pain while he was washing the wound. On the 5th day, she brought a pot of boiled water herself, without asking. On the 7th day, the girl opened her eyes and smiled at her, and Haeyeon turned away so quickly that Dan barely had time to notice her eyes were wet. She was a warrior. She was the assassin who'd been sent to slit his throat, and she was crying because her sister had smiled. Dan thought that of all the people he'd met in this world, Haeyeon was the one he recognized most. He knew people like that, soldiers who'd forgotten how to be human, because humanity is a luxury you don't carry into war. He'd been one himself for many years. The girl's wound was healing well. There was no infection, Clean hands and boiled water did their job. 2 weeks later, the girl was sitting up on her own. 3 weeks later, she was walking. The scar would be terrible. 3 deep gashes across her entire side. But she was alive. Haeyeon didn't go anywhere. She didn't say she'd stay forever. She didn't say she'd abandoned her mission. She was simply there, every day. She carried water, she chopped wood for the hearth, she stood at the entrance when strangers came. One night, Dan woke up to a rustling sound. Someone was near his hut. He peeked out. Haeyeon was standing by the wall with a stone knife in her hand. A shadow darted past her in the darkness. A man. A man. He ran away. Haeyeon didn't chase after him. She stood there and waited until the shadow vanished into the darkness. Then she put the knife away. She looked at Dan. She said briefly, "Sleep." In the morning, Dan found a clay bowl by the wall of his hut. It contained a wet powder. He sniffed it. He rubbed it between his fingers. It tasted bitter. The smell was sharp and grassy. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he knew what alkaloids smelled like. Poison. Someone had tried to slip poison into his water or food, and Haeyeon had stopped them. Dan sat down and thought for a long time. Hwaran. It could only have been Hwaran. A direct attack, not whispers, not messengers. Poisoning. He moved from words to action. Dan looked at the bowl of poison, then at Haeyeon, who was chewing a flatbread by the entrance and pretending that nothing had happened that night. Then at the sky above the valley, gray and low-hanging, just like on the first day. He thought about Nari, about whether she'd made it to her sister, about whether she was already teaching someone to wash their hands, about whether the network would grow faster than Hwaran's. Then he thought about the fact that he now had a bodyguard who'd been sent to kill him, and that this was the strangest thing that had happened to him in the last month. And it had been a very strange month. He stood up. He walked over to Haeyeon. She looked up. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Thank you for last night." Haeyeon shrugged. Then she said, "You stitched up my sister. I'm standing at your door. That's fair." Dan nodded. He looked at the gash on her left eyebrow. Old, long since healed. Crooked, rough. No stitches. He said, "Who stitched up your eyebrow?" Haeyeon touched the scar with her finger. "No one. I did it myself." Dan shook his head. A primitive world. No one stitched up a warrior's cut eyebrow. Because a warrior must endure. Because scars are a mark of valor. Because no one knew how. He said, "If it gets cut again, come see me. I'll stitch it up properly." Haeyeon looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. Then she turned away. But Dan managed to see that she was smiling. Quickly and crookedly, like someone who'd forgotten how to do it and was figuring it out as she went along. Haeyeon, from the Black Otter tribe, came to Dan with her wounded sister. She had been sent by the Tennu to kill him, but couldn't go through with it after seeing him stitch up her sister's wound. That night, Haeyeon caught a man trying to poison Dan. It was Hwaran's first direct attempt to kill the outsider. Nari returned 20 days later. She didn't come alone. 2 women followed her. One was young, about 20. The other was older. Both were over 40. Both were midwives. Both were from the Black Otter tribe. Nari led them to the Hut of Pure Hands. She brought them before Dan and said, "They're ready. Teach them." Dan looked at her. She had lost weight over those 20 days. Her cheekbones had become more pronounced. Dark circles had settled under her eyes. But her eyes were different. Not the same as a month ago. A month ago, they held guilt. Now they held fire. The quiet, steady fire of a person who had found a cause worth staying awake for. She explained, The Black Otter tribe welcomed her with caution. Her sister helped. The midwives came to listen. Nari showed them everything, washing their hands, boiling water, clean bandages. She explained about the little evil spirits in the dirt. 2 of the midwives believed her. The rest did not. The Tennu of the Black Otter came to her on the 3rd day and said she was spreading the word of a demon. Nari replied that she was spreading the word of living women. The Tennu fell silent. He wasn't a Huaran. He was gentler, weaker, or wiser. He didn't interfere, but he didn't help either. The 2 midwives who had come with Nari made up their own minds. They wanted to see. They wanted to learn. They wanted to understand why not a single woman in labor had died at the Grey Herons this season. Dan taught them for 3 days, from morning until night. Nari translated what he could not say in the Black Otter dialect. He taught them the same things he had taught Nari: hands, water, cleanliness. Boil the knife used to cut the umbilical cord. Change the hides on the birthing bed. Examine the afterbirth in its entirety. If the woman in labor has a fever on the 2nd day, it means evil spirits are already inside her. Then give her plenty to drink. Boiled water with honey, a decoction of willow bark for the fever. And pray, because that was all he could give them. Antibiotics didn't exist. If the infection set in deeply, the woman would die. Dan knew this. Nari knew this. The midwives from Black Otter would understand this when they encountered their first case that clean hands couldn't save. And then they would have to stay strong. He told them, "You won't save everyone. No one will save everyone. But you'll save many. And every woman you save is someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's world." The midwives listened. They nodded. One of them was crying, quietly, without wiping away her tears. She too had her own names, her own list, her own 40 or 50 women whom she had buried, thinking that was how it was supposed to be. On the 4th day, they went back to Black Otter, with little bags of ashes, with pots, with strips of boiled hide, with knowledge in their heads that weighed more than all their cargo. Dan stood at the gate and counted. Nari, 2 midwives from Black Otter, 3 people, 3 pairs of hands, 3 tribes that could now survive. It was a beginning, but it wasn't enough. Because there were about 20 tribes in the valley, and in most of them, the Ten'u listened to Kavaran. And Kavaran didn't stop. Yuna brought news every 2 or 3 days. Kavaran sent out more messengers, now to 7 tribes instead of 4. He repeated the same message: a demon in human form, the wrath of the Nameless One, a stranger stealing the spirit's work. But he added something new. He said that the women Dan had saved were cursed, that their children would carry the demon's breath within them, that through these children, the Nameless One would enter every family. It was clever, terribly clever, because the children Dan had saved were infants. They couldn't walk yet. They couldn't talk yet. Any illness, any cough, any rash on the skin, and people would say, "There it is, the curse." Dan had said that Havaran was a demon, and here was the proof. Dan sat in the hut of clean hands and thought. He couldn't fight Havaran with his own weapons. He couldn't send out messengers. He couldn't whisper in corners. He was an outsider with an accent and strange habits. Every word he spoke was scrutinized. Every step he took was tracked. There was only one thing he could do: heal. Do what he does, and hope that the result would speak louder than the whisper of the old man in feathers. But results take time, and Quran was in a hurry. In the 6th week of the 3rd month, something happened that Dan hadn't expected. A woman arrived at the Grey Heron settlement, alone, unescorted, on foot, a 2-day journey from the Redstone tribe. Tall, with a stern face, with eyes that assessed everything around her the way a merchant assesses merchandise. She hadn't come for treatment. She wasn't pregnant. She had come to trade. Her name was Tara, 28 years old, the eldest sister of the Redstone tribe's chief, a widow, childless. She managed her tribe's affairs because her younger brother, the chief, drank more fermented honey than he spent time thinking about business. Tara came to Kelkon. Kelkon sent her to Dan because Tara wasn't asking about the grain trade. She was asking about clean hands. She sat down across from Dan in the hut of clean hands. She looked around, at the pots, at the sleeping platforms, at the notches on the post. She counted the notches. Then she looked at Dan and spoke, directly, without preamble, without ceremonial phrases, like someone who values time. She said she'd heard about him. She'd heard that not a single woman in labor had died at the Grey Heron that season. She'd heard that he healed with his hands, not with incantations. She'd heard that Kavarin called him a demon. She didn't care about Kavarin. She didn't care about demons. But she did care that 6 women in her tribe had died in childbirth over the past year. 6 out of 14. Almost 1 in 2. Her tribe is dying out. And she didn't come to beg. She came to propose a deal. Grain, hides, guards, salt. Everything Dan and his tribe need, in exchange for one thing. Teach my midwives. Dan listened. Then he asked, "What will your tenyu say?" Tara looked at him coldly. "My tenyu will say whatever I tell him to say." Dan raised an eyebrow. Tara didn't smile. She wasn't joking. She really did rule her tribe through her brother, and her tenyu knew who paid for the grain he ate. Dan thought for exactly 10 seconds. Then he said yes. He'd send Nari, or he'd go himself. Tara nodded. She stood up. Then she paused at the door. She turned around and said something that made Dan freeze. She said, "I lost a child 7 years ago during childbirth." The midwife didn't know what to do. The tenyu chanted incantations. The child died. I nearly died myself. Then she said she wanted to know, if he had been there back then, would he have been able to? Dan looked at her stern face, which hadn't flinched once during the entire conversation, at her arms, which hung motionless at her sides, at her eyes, in which something glinted, but she wouldn't let it show. He replied, "Maybe, or maybe not. I'm not God. I'm a human who knows just a little more." Tara stood there for a second. 2, 3. Then she nodded. She turned around. She walked out. Dan heard her walking down the path with a quick, steady stride, without stopping even once. Yuna was sitting in the corner and heard everything. She looked at Dan, then at the door through which Tara had left, then back at Dan, and she said, "She's strong." Dan nodded. "Yes, she's strong." Then he added, "And she needs help, like all strong people who would never ask for it." That evening, for the first time, Dan sat down and wrote it down, with a stick on clay, not in his own language, in the tribe's language, using the symbols Yuna had devised. 10 rules. 10 simple rules he called the rules of clean hands. Wash your hands before the birth. Wash your hands after the birth. Boil water. Boil the knife. Boil the thread. Lay the mother on a clean surface. Examine the afterbirth in its entirety. If there's a fever on the 2nd day, give her willow bark tea and plenty of water. Don't pour ash into an open wound. Separate the sick from the healthy. 10 rules. Each one can be learned in a minute. Each one can be passed down by word of mouth. Each one saves lives. Yuna helped write them down. She looked at the clay tablet and her eyes burned. She understood what this was. Not a spell, not a prayer. Knowledge. Written down, preserved, passed on. She said, "If this is carved into stone, it will remain forever." Dan looked at her and thought that this girl could see further than he could. Nari returned from Black Otter with 2 trained midwives. Tara from the Redstone tribe came with a trade proposal and became Dan's political ally. Quran intensified his campaign against Dan by spreading the rumor that the children of rescued mothers were cursed. Dan inscribed the 10 rules of clean hands on a clay tablet using Yuna's writing system. The first snow fell on the valley at the beginning of the 3rd month of winter. By that time, Dan had been living with the Gray Heron tribe for nearly half a year. He kept track of the days with notches on the wall of his hut. 174 notches. 174 days in a world without antibiotics, without electricity, without steel. He was alive. That in itself was an achievement. But that morning, when the snow covered the huts and the paths and the slopes and the riverbank with a heavy white blanket, Dan wasn't thinking about achievements. He was thinking about the boy. His father had brought him, a huge man, a scar running across his entire face, from his forehead to his chin. Hands like logs. He'd been walking through the blizzard for a day and a half. From the Gray Bull tribe. A 4-day journey in good weather. A day and a half through snow and wind and darkness. Without stopping. Without sleep. Because his son lay in his arms. 8 years old. An open fracture of the shin. The bone was sticking out of the skin. The leg below the knee was blue, almost black in the folds. Gangrene was setting in. The smell. Dan recognized that smell the moment he stepped through the doorway. A sweetish, heavy smell of rotting flesh. He knew it from field hospitals, from minefields, from ruins. A smell that makes normal people turn away. Dan stepped closer. He laid the boy on a cot. He examined the leg. A fracture of the tibia, open. The edge of the bone was dirty. The surrounding tissue was inflamed. The swelling had reached the knee. The gangrene hadn't spread too deep yet. Not yet. But by morning, it would have. And then the leg would have to be amputated, or the boy would die. The father stood by the wall. He didn't speak. He couldn't. 2 days without sleep or food, chest deep in snow with a child in his arms, had drained him of everything. He just stood there and watched. And in that gaze was everything Dan had seen hundreds of times. In the eyes of mothers standing over bombed-out houses. In the eyes of fathers at the doors of the operating room. Save him. Nothing else. Just save him. Dan turned to Yuna. "Poppy. I need Poppy. A decoction. As much as we have." Yuna ran off to Nari. Nari kept a stash of dried poppy capsules. Not much. Dan had been saving them for an emergency. This was an emergency. While Yuna ran, Dan prepared everything. He boiled water in 3 pots. He heated a bone needle over the fire until it was red hot. He soaked a reindeer tendon in the boiling water. He cut strips of boiled hide for bandages. He prepared a splint. 2 pieces of birch bark. Even, smooth. He'd cut them out a month ago. He'd been preparing. He knew that sooner or later there would be a fracture. In a world where children climb trees and run across rocks, fractures are only a matter of time. Yuna brought the poppy decoction. Dan checked it. Thick, dark, bitter. This would last an hour, maybe an hour and a half. He gave the boy a drink. The boy was conscious. His eyes were clouded with pain. His lips were gray, but he wasn't crying. Dan had seen this in children during the war. They stop crying when the pain crosses a certain threshold. The body simply shuts off that signal. 20 minutes later, the poppy took effect. The boy went limp, his eyes closed. His breathing became steady and deep. Dan began. First, the wound. He rinsed it with boiled water 3 times. He cleaned out the dirt, the dead tissue, the pus, every bit of necrosis he could find. Nari assisted. She held the leg, changed the water, handed him strips of clean skin. Her hands didn't tremble, not once. Then the bone. Dan said it. That was the hardest part. Setting an open fracture without an X-ray meant working blind, only with his hands, only by feel. The bone had to snap back into place. The ends had to line up. If they didn't, the leg would heal crooked, or not heal at all. He worked slowly, millimeter by millimeter, feeling with his fingers how the edge of the bone slid along the other edge, how the tissues parted and came together, how the muscle fibers fall into place. There, the bone is in place. Dan exhaled. Then the suture, 30 stitches, deer tendon, with a bone needle, every stitch precise, every one at the same distance. 8 years of field surgery had turned his hands into instruments that worked on their own. His brain gave the command and his hands carried it out, as if on autopilot. Then the splint, birch bark on both sides, wrapped with strips of leather, tight but not too tight. Blood had to flow. If he tightened it too much, new necrosis would set in. Then the bandage, clean, boiled. Then the wait, 6 hours. 6 hours from start to finish. When Dan finished and straightened up, his back shot with such pain that he stepped aside and braced himself against the wall with his hand. 6 hours on his knees over the cot. At 34, that doesn't go unnoticed anymore. He washed his hands. Slowly. Thoroughly. Out of habit, a habit that had become a ritual. He turned around. The boy's father was standing in the same spot. He hadn't moved for 6 hours. He'd just been standing there, watching. And when Dan turned around, this huge man with a scar across his entire face sank to his knees. Slowly, heavily, like a tree falling. His forehead touched the dirt floor. Dan walked over to him, gripped his shoulders, lifted him up. It was like lifting a rock, a heavy, immovable rock. He set him on his feet, looked him in the eyes, and said, "Not to me, to him." He nodded toward the boy sleeping on the cot. He'd survived on his own. I just helped. The father looked at him, then at his son, then back at Dan. He didn't fully understand the words. His dialect was different, but he grasped the main point. The stranger hadn't accepted his bow. The stranger had lifted him from his knees. The stranger had pointed to his son and said that his son was strong. In a world where for a man to kneel is to surrender his honor, and for a stranger to lift him from his knees is to restore that honor, that moment was worth more than any words. Nari stood by the wall. Yuna sat in the corner. Hae-young froze in the doorway. Sewon. Dan hadn't noticed when she came in. A thin, pale, 19-year-old priestess stood in the shadows by the entrance, watching it all with wide eyes. She had come on her own, quietly, like a shadow, and she watched. They all watched. And in that very moment, they all understood the same thing. This man, this stranger without a name or a tribe, this Tan Hei, he was someone they could follow. The boy woke up by morning. His leg hurt, but he was breathing, and the color of his skin below the knee was right, pink, not blue. Blood was flowing. The tissue was alive. The gangrene had receded. Dung changed the bandage every day. He washed the wound. He checked the stitches. He checked the splint. After a week, the swelling went down. After 2 weeks, the boy began to wiggle his toes. After 3, he was sitting on a cot and smiling. After a month, he was standing on 2 legs, with a cane for support, but he was standing. His father didn't leave. For all 4 weeks, he lived at the Clean Hands hut. He chopped wood, he carried water, he repaired the walls. Silently, without a single word. He was simply there. And every time Dan walked by, he nodded to him, briefly, like a soldier to a soldier. A father from the Grey Bull tribe brought his son in with an open fracture of the shin and incipient gangrene. Dan performed a 6-hour operation by the light of a fire, using poppy-based anesthesia. The boy survived and was back on his feet a month later. Savan first appeared at the hut of Clean Hands, silently watching Dan at work. Savan came at night. It was the 4th month. Dan was already drifting off to sleep when he heard a rustle at the doorway. Quiet, cautious, like an animal afraid of a trap. He opened his eyes. A figure stood in the doorway, slender, thin, trembling. He recognized her by her silhouette. Savan, the junior priestess, Huaran's apprentice. That very same pale girl with huge eyes who had stood in the shadows while he operated on the boy. He'd seen her before. She was always by Huaran's side, standing behind him, carrying his bowl of potions, chanting the incantations he told her to chant. The old man's shadow, an extension of his arms. Savan stood in the doorway, trembling, not from the cold, from fear. Dan sat down on the cot. He waited. She didn't move. She stood there, staring at him, as if she were deciding whether or not to jump off a cliff. He said quietly, "Come in." She entered. 2 steps. 3. She stopped in the middle of the hut. She stood as still as a pillar. Her hands pressed against her chest. Her fingers were white with tension. Dan pointed to a spot across from him. "Sit down." She sat down, on the floor. She wrapped her arms around herself. She was silent. Dan waited. He knew how to wait. In field hospitals, it sometimes happened that the wounded couldn't speak for hours, not because of their wounds, because of what they'd seen. They needed time. Savan spoke after 5 minutes, quietly, almost in a whisper. She spoke haltingly. She jumped from one thing to another, but the gist was simple. She had seen it. She had seen Huaran order the boy to slip poison into the water Dan was using to wash the wounded. That first time. When Haeyong intercepted the poisoner near the hut, it was a boy from Huaran's household staff. He was 12 years old. Huaran promised him that the Nameless One would take his mother away if he didn't do as he was told. The boy did it. Haeyong caught him. The boy ran away. Huaran said nothing, but Sewon saw it. She was standing behind the curtain in Huaran's hut when he gave the boy a bowl of powder and told him what to do. She heard every word. And she kept quiet, because she was afraid. Because Huaran was all she had, for 6 years. Since she was 6, he had taught her, fed her, clothed her, given her a place in the tribe. Without him, she was nobody, an orphan, a mouth with nothing to feed, a body with no one to protect her. Huaran had given her everything, and she stayed silent when he tried to kill a man. She spoke and trembled. The words poured out of her like blood from a wound, in spurts, painfully. Then she fell silent. She looked at Dan and asked, "You're going to kill me now." Dan looked at her. 19 years old, slender arms, a pale face, huge eyes filled with terror, not of him, but of herself, of what she had done, and of what she hadn't done. He said, "No, I'm not a murderer. Come here, sit closer." "You're shaking." She moved closer. He tossed some firewood into the hearth. He took a flatbread out of the bag, broke it in half, gave her one half. She took it, held it in her hands, didn't eat it. He poured her some warm water from the jug that always stood by the hearth. She drank it. Then she said, "I didn't know what to do." Dan nodded. "Now you know. You came. That's the solution." She was silent for a long time. Then she began to cry, quietly, without a sound. Tears ran down her cheeks, but her face remained motionless, like a mask. She had forgotten how to cry like a human being, or perhaps she had never known how. Dan didn't hug her. He didn't pat her on the head. He didn't try to comfort her. He knew she didn't need comfort right now. She needed someone who wouldn't turn away, just to sit there beside her and not look away. He sat there. She cried. The fire crackled. Snow fell outside the walls. An hour later, she calmed down. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at him, and there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, not gratitude. A question. "What should I do now?" Dan answered, "Do what you know how to do." You know herbs, you know decoctions, you know how to speak to people in a language they understand. The language of spirits, the language of rituals. I don't know that language. You do. Help me speak so that people will hear. Savan listened. Then she nodded, slowly, like someone who, for the first time in their life, had made a decision on their own. Not because they were told to, not because they were afraid, but because they wanted to. From that day on, Savan came every evening, quietly, unnoticed. Huaren didn't know, or pretended not to know. She taught Dan what she knew about herbs. He taught her what he knew about the body. They exchanged knowledge the way merchants exchange goods. And Dan discovered that Huaren, for all his obscurantism, knew more about herbs than Dan had expected. A wormwood decoction for fever. It worked. Wormwood contained substances that reduced fever. Not as effective as willow bark, but it worked. A poultice made from leaves that Savan called by a word Dan couldn't translate. He asked her to show him the plant. She brought it. He recognized it. Plantain. An antiseptic. A wound healer. Huaren was using it correctly. A mixture of herbs that Quran gave to women after childbirth to help them regain their strength. Savan listed the ingredients. Dan listened. Stinging nettle. Mint. Honey. Barley broth. It was a nutritious, vitamin-rich drink. Rough, primitive, but it worked. Quran wasn't a quack. That was the problem. He knew herbs. He knew a thing or two about the body. He really did heal. Sometimes. A little. But his healing was wrapped in incantations and fear. And alongside what worked, he did things that killed. Ash in wounds. A dirty ritual knife. A ritual bowl with a piece of old leather in it, in which he washed his instruments. He mixed medicine with superstition and couldn't tell one from the other because no one had taught him to distinguish between them. Dan asked Savan about the knife, the ritual copper knife used to cut the umbilical cord. Savan explained. There was only one knife, copper, old. It had been passed down among the tribes. The tennu of the gray heron, the tennu of the black otter, the tennu of the red stone, the tennu of the white owl. They all used the same knife. They all washed it in the same ritual bowl. A piece of old leather floated in the bowl. They called it the skin of the first mother, the foremother, a sacred relic. The knife was placed in this bowl. It touched this skin. Then this knife was used to cut the umbilical cord. For every woman in labor, in every tribe. Dan listened and felt a chill rising inside him. Not anger, a chill. The professional, clinical chill he felt when he found the source of an epidemic. There it was. One knife, one bowl, one piece of rotting skin, a carrier of infection, the perfect vector. Streptococcus or staphylococcus, or both, living in the warm, moist environment of a piece of old skin in a ritual bowl, carried by the knife from one woman in labor to the next, from tribe to tribe. Childbed fever, not the wrath of the nameless one, not a curse, an infection, spread by priests who thought they were carrying a blessing. He had found the source. Now he had to prove it in a way that would convince not just him. He already knew. He had to make them believe it. All of them. And Hwaran first and foremost. Dan looked at Savan. She was sitting across from him, waiting. He asked, "Can you bring me that knife?" Savan turned pale. The knife was kept in Hwaran's hut, a sacred object. Only a Ten'u was allowed to touch it. Stealing it meant death. Dan said, "Not now. Not today. But when the time comes, I'll need that knife." Savan looked at him. Then she nodded, with a single movement, brief, decisive. She had made up her mind again, on her own. Savan came to Dan that night and told him about the poisoning attempt organized by Hwaran. She became his link to the world of priestly traditions and told him about the ritual copper knife used to cut the umbilical cord in all the tribes of the valley. Dan realized that this knife and the ritual bowl with a piece of old leather were the source of the epidemic of childbed fever. Winter had gripped the valley and wouldn't let go. It snowed every day. The river was covered with a crust of ice along its banks. The trails between the tribes became impassable. This was both a curse and a salvation. A curse because the sick couldn't reach Dan. A salvation because Hwaran couldn't get a response from his messengers. Winter sealed off the valley like a lid on a pot. Dan made the most of this time. He worked every day with Nari, with Yuna, with Savon, and with Haeyoung. Each of them taught him as much as he taught them. Nari taught him midwifery techniques that had been passed down among midwives for generations. Some were nonsensical. Tying a red thread around the mother's belly, placing a river stone under the birthing bed, singing a specific song when the baby is on its way. But some were brilliant. Nari knew a technique for applying pressure to the abdomen from the bottom up in cases of retained placenta. Dan recognized it as a modified version of the Creed maneuver. She knew how to determine the baby's position by the shape of the belly 2 weeks before delivery. She knew that if a woman in labor's feet were getting cold and her lips were turning blue, her pelvis needed to be raised higher than her head. It was empirical medicine, rough, without theory. But it worked. Because it was backed by hundreds of years of observation. Hundreds of midwives who noticed what worked and what didn't and passed it on, along with red threads and river stones. Yuna taught him to write, or rather, they taught each other. Yuna devised a system of symbols for sounds, not for words, for sounds. Each symbol represented a single syllable. Dan recognized in this the beginnings of a syllabic writing system, like Japanese kana, or like Sumerian cuneiform in its early form. Yuna invented it herself, at 17, in a world without books, without schools, without any idea that writing even existed. He worked with her every evening. They sat by the hearth and scratched symbols onto clay tablets. Yuna asked questions, nonstop. Why is the sky blue? Why is fire hot? Why do children resemble their parents? Why do some people get sick while others don't? Why does the moon change? Dan answered what he could. For the rest, he said he didn't know. Yuna wrote everything down, both the answers and the questions without answers. She said that a question without an answer is more important than an answer without a question. Dan thought she was a philosopher. Then he thought she was a scientist. Then he thought that in his world, she would be a Nobel laureate. But in this world, she was being prepared to be the wife of a foreign leader. And that thought made him want to punch someone. Hae-young taught him something else. Tactics. She showed him the valley. She drew maps on the ground. Here's the trail from the gray heron to the black otter. Here's the trail to the red stone. Here's the pass to the white owl. She knew every turn, every ford, every spot where an ambush could be set up. She was a scout, the best in her tribe. And she shared this with Dan because she understood what he hadn't yet fully grasped. War is coming. Not the kind of war Dan was used to, not bullets and explosions, a different kind. Quiet, slow. A war of words and messengers and poisons and nighttime visits. Waran had been waging this war for 30 years. Dan was a newcomer to it. Hae-young told him straight out, if the Council of Tribes convenes in the spring and the Tenyu demand your extradition, Kelhan won't be able to refuse. Not because he's weak, because one tribe against 5 means death for everyone. He'll hand you over. Dan asked, what then? Hae-young looked at him. Then we'll run. I know the trails. Dan shook his head. No, we won't run. If I run away, the knowledge will go with me. Nari will be left alone. The midwives of Black Otter will be left without support. Everything we've built over the past 6 months will come crashing down. Hae-young frowned. Then what? Dan said. Then we'll make sure the council doesn't demand my extradition. How? Dan said. I need a knife. Between classes and plans, there was the usual work. People were sick. Children broke their arms and legs. The elderly coughed up blood. A woman from the neighboring hut scalded her hand with boiling broth. A man fell while hunting and dislocated his shoulder. A boy stepped on a sharp rock and cut his foot open. Dan treated them all, every day, without a day off, without rest. Because he was alone. One doctor for 200 people. And he couldn't say no. He couldn't look at a mother with a sick child and say, "Come back tomorrow, I'm tired." Because the child might not live to see tomorrow. The fatigue built up. He woke up with pain in his back. He fell asleep with pain in his hands. He ate little. He slept even less. Nari noticed. She saw how he would sit down on the floor after seeing yet another patient and close his eyes for a minute. How his hands would tremble when he untied a bandage. How he would rub his temples when he thought no one was watching. She came to him one evening. She brought him some hot tea. She set it down in front of him. She sat down beside him. She said, "You can't save everyone." Dan lifted his head. He looked at her. "I know." "Then stop trying." He smiled wryly. "I can't." Nari was silent. Then she said quietly, "You'll die here. Not from Hwaran's knife, from exhaustion. And then who will teach? Who will finish what you started?" Dan looked at her face lit by the fire, at the dark circles under her eyes, at her hands resting on her knees, strong hands, dependable. She was right. He knew she was right. But knowing and doing are two different things. He said, "I need more students, not just Nari, not just the 2 midwives from Black Otter. 10, 20, so that every tribe has its own person, so that I don't have to run through a blizzard every time someone breaks a leg." Nari nodded. "In the spring, when the snow melts." Dan nodded. "In the spring, if we make it that far." Nari stood up. She walked toward the door. She stopped, turned around. She said, "You'll make it. I'll make sure of it." She left. Dan sat there, staring at the closed door. Then he finished his herbal tea. Then he lay down on the cot. Then he closed his eyes. And for the first time in 180 days, he fell asleep so quickly that he didn't have time to think about anything. Mira appeared at the end of winter. Dan found her on his own. It was during the third month of winter. Kelhan sent hunters to check on the distant huts on the eastern slope of the valley. Families who grazed goats on the upper pastures lived there. In the summer, they were part of the tribe. In winter, they were cut off. Dan went with the hunters, not because he was called, because Nari said there were sick people and elderly folks in those huts whom no one had visited since the snow began to fall. Haeyoung went with him, without a word. She just got up and went. By this time, she no longer said she was going with him. She just walked, like a shadow, like a bodyguard no one had appointed, but whom everyone accepted. They walked for half a day, knee-deep in snow, along a trail that had been buried so deeply that only Haeyoung could find it. She walked ahead and read the ground like a book. There was a rock right here, a turn right here, a cliff on the right here. Don't go near the edge. Dan followed her, thinking she was worth an entire navigation team. The first 3 huts were in good condition. The people had survived the winter, thin, hungry, but alive. Dan examined 2 elderly men who were coughing. He gave them a willow bark decoction. He showed them how to inhale steam from a hot stone doused with water and mint. He bandaged the boys' frostbitten fingers. The 4th hut was empty. The doorway was blocked by snow from the inside. Haeyoung dug it out. Inside, it was as cold as outside. The hearth was out. The animal skins on the sleeping platforms were frozen through. 2 people lay on the floor, a man and a woman, dead. For a long time. Maybe 3 weeks, maybe longer. The cold had preserved the bodies. The man lay by the door. He'd tried to get out. He couldn't. The woman lay on the bed. She was covered with all the animal skins in the hut, not her own, but someone else's. Someone had covered her before dying by the door. Dan stood there looking at them. 8 years of hot spots, hundreds of dead bodies. He thought he'd gotten used to it. No, he hadn't. You never get used to it. He'd just learned to breathe steadily while everything inside was burning. Haeyoung touched his shoulder. She pointed to the corner. Dan looked. In the corner of the hut, behind an overturned pot, there was something. Hides. Crumpled. And underneath them. Dan walked over. He moved the pot aside. He lifted a hide. A girl. A little girl. Curled up in a ball. Her eyes closed. Her skin was gray. Dan pressed his fingers to her neck. A pulse. Weak. Barely there. But it was there. She was alive. He lifted her. She weighed as little as a bird. Bones beneath her skin. Her ribs were visible to the touch. Dehydration. Starvation. Hypothermia. She had been hiding here, next to her dead parents. How long? 3 days? 5? A week? She drank water from a pot until the water froze. She ate whatever she could find. Then there was nothing left to eat. Then she lay down and closed her eyes. Dan held her close, wrapped her in his pelt, ran back along the trail. Haeyoung ran beside him. The hunters were after them. They ran for 3 hours, through the snow, knee-deep, along a trail that was already starting to get covered up. The girl didn't move. She didn't moan. She just breathed, barely. At the Clean Hands hut, Dan laid her by the hearth. He built a fire, a big, hot fire. He removed the frozen hides from her, covered her with warm ones. Nari heated water. Yuna ran to get honey. Sewon brought a herbal decoction. Dan gave the girl warm water with honey to drink, drop by drop, from his finger. When a person hasn't eaten for several days, you can't give them too much at once. The stomach won't accept it. Vomiting will set in. A dehydrated body will lose its last reserves of water, drop by drop, a sip at a time, slowly. For the first day, he didn't leave her side. Nor did he on the second. Nari sat nearby. They took turns. One would sleep for an hour, the other would watch over her. Then they'd switch. On the third day, the girl opened her eyes. Brown, huge, empty. She looked at Dan, but didn't see him. She looked right through him, at some place that existed only in her mind. Dan had seen that look before, in children at refugee camps, in children who'd watched their parents die. A look that says there's no one inside. The person is gone. Only a shell remains. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She didn't move unless she was moved. She ate when food was put into her mouth. She drank when water was brought to her lips. But she didn't do anything on her own. Dan called it a dissociative stupor to himself. In his world, she would have been given medication, taken to a psychiatrist, placed in a warm ward with padded walls. Here, he had none of that. He had patience and time and his hands. He sat next to her every day. He didn't touch her. He didn't force her to speak. He didn't ask questions. He just sat there. He worked nearby. He talked to Nari, to Yuna, to Savan, softly, calmly, ordinary conversations. How much ash was left? When to boil the next batch of water? Whose bandage needed changing today? He created a soundscape, a backdrop of safety, a backdrop of life that goes on, that poses no threat, that simply is. After a week, the girl began to turn her head towards sounds. After 2 weeks, she began to follow Dan with her eyes as he moved around the hut. After 3 weeks, she reached for the food bowl on her own. Dan saw this and didn't let on. He didn't look. He didn't say anything. Because if he drew attention to it, she'd get scared and go back. Back into that emptiness, to that place where no one is. A month later, she stood up, on her own, without help. She walked out of the cabin. She stood in the doorway and looked at the snow. Dan stood behind her and watched her, a slender figure in unfamiliar furs, 14 years old, an orphan, the sole survivor. She turned and looked at him, and for the first time in a month, there was something in her eyes, not emptiness, a question. Where should I go? Dan crouched down in front of her, looked into her eyes, and said, "Nowhere. You're home." She didn't answer, she didn't nod, but that evening, she didn't go to sleep on the cot in the hut of clean hands. Instead, she lay down at the threshold of his hut. She curled up in a ball on the pelt, like a puppy, like a wolf cub that had found a den. Dan came out. He saw her. He stood there for a moment. Then he took the pelt from his own cot. He covered her with it. He lay down next to her on the floor, the bare earthen floor, because he'd given her his skin. Nari found them in the morning, Dan on the floor and the girl next to him, wrapped in his skins. Nari stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she left. She returned with 2 skins. She placed one over Dan and the other beside him. She didn't say a word. Dan woke up and saw the hides, and Nari, who was boiling water by the hearth as if nothing had happened. He thought that this woman understood him better than anyone in either world. He named the girl Mira. That wasn't her real name. She didn't speak and couldn't say what her name was. Dan chose that name because in Spanish, Mira means look, and because in his language, it meant peace. Mira. Look. Peace. She began to speak in the 6th week. 1 word. Water. Then 2. Water. Eat. Then 3. Then whole sentences. She spoke in a dialect that differed slightly from that of the gray heron, but Yuna understood. Mira didn't tell him what had happened. She didn't describe how her parents had died. She didn't talk about those days in the cold hut next to the dead bodies. She kept silent about it. And Dan didn't ask. When she was ready, she would tell him. Or she wouldn't. That was her right. Instead, Mira started doing something else. She started helping. Silently. Without being asked. One morning, she simply handed Dan a pot of boiled water before he asked for it. Then she brought strips of clean leather for bandages. Then she started washing her hands before touching anything in the hut of clean hands. She watched. She memorized. She repeated them. Like a shadow learning to be human by watching another person. Yuna began teaching her the symbols. Mira learned them in 3 days, faster than anyone else. Yuna told Dan that the girl remembers everything the first time. Dan wasn't surprised. Trauma sometimes does that to the brain. It closes some doors and throws others wide open. Mira began carrying his tool bag for him, a bag that Dan had sewn from leather. Inside were bone needles, suture threads, strips of clean leather, a small pouch of ashes, a bundle of willow bark, and a bundle of yarrow. Mira carried that bag the way a soldier carries a weapon, carefully, responsibly. She wouldn't give it to anyone, not even Nari. It was her job, her place. The first place in life she'd chosen for herself. Dan looked at her and saw a girl who didn't need a doctor. She needed a father. And he understood that he'd become one. Not by blood, not by choice, by fact. She slept on his doorstep. She ate from his bowl. She followed him like a shadow. And when one of the hunters once tried to take her tool bag away, just to help, Mira clung to it with such force and looked at him with such an expression that the hunter backed off. And Heian, who saw this, snorted and said, "Little wolf." Dan corrected her, "My little wolf cub." Heian looked at him. She nodded and said nothing more, because there was no need. Dan had found a 14-year-old girl in an abandoned cabin on the eastern slope next to her dead parents. She had spent several weeks in a dissociative stupor before she began to come to her senses. Dan named her Mira, and she began carrying his tool bag and learning faster than anyone else. Spring arrived overnight. Dan fell asleep to the howling wind and the crackling of ice, and woke up to the sound of water. The river had broken open. The noise was as if the earth had split apart. The ice flowed downstream in huge sheets, colliding, shattering, and rushing toward the valley's exit. The snow on the slopes had settled and darkened. Streams rushed down the trails. The air had changed. It was damp and alive. It smelled of earth and decaying grass, and something else. Hope. Dan stepped out of the cabin and stood in the doorway. Mira stood beside him. She was no longer sleeping by the doorway. During the last weeks of winter, Nari had set up a bed for her inside the hut. Without a word, she just set it up, and that was that. Dan didn't object. Mira was his daughter. Everyone saw it. Everyone accepted it. Kelhan came to see him on the first day of spring. The chief had aged over the winter. His face had grown harsher, his eyes deeper. Winter had taken 3 elders and 2 infants. Not from illnesses that Dan could have cured, from the cold, from hunger, from their bodies simply giving out. Kelhan sat down across from him and began to speak. Dan now understood almost everything. 8 months of studying the language had given him freedom. Not perfect freedom. His accent remained. Some constructions were difficult. But he could speak and understand, argue and joke. Kelhan spoke of the council of tribes. Every spring, after the river thawed, the chiefs and Tenu gathered in a large clearing at the confluence of 3 streams. They discussed borders, pastures, disputes, marriages. It was the only form of law in the valley, an unwritten law, a law of voices, strength, and authority. This year, there would be one issue on the council's agenda: Dan. Kelhan stated it plainly. Havaran had been preparing all winter. His messengers had reached 7 tribes before the snow closed off the trails. The Tenhu of those tribes had heard his words. A demon in human form. The wrath of the Nameless One. Cursed children. Not everyone believed it, but enough to raise the issue at the council. If the council demands Dan's extradition, Kelthan will have to obey, or start a war. 1 tribe against 7. He won't start a war. He can't afford to lose people. Dan listened. Then he asked, "When is the council?" "In 20 days, Kelthan replied, "when the road dries out and everyone can make the journey." 20 days, Dan nodded. "That's enough." Kelthan looked at him with an expression Dan had already learned to read. The chief wanted to believe, but he was afraid. Dan said, "I need one thing. A knife. Kavarana's ritual knife." Kelthan tensed. That knife was sacred. To take it from the Tenhu meant to insult the spirits, or to start a conflict that could tear the tribe apart from within. Dan explained, "Not now. At the council, in front of everyone. I'll show that this knife kills, not a curse. Not the Nameless One, the knife. The dirty knife used to cut the umbilical cord carries within it those very small, evil spirits I spoke of." Kelthan was silent. Then he said, "If you make a mistake, they'll kill you, and I won't be able to stop them." Dan nodded. "I know." While Dan prepared for the council, he didn't stop working. Spring brought new patients. People from distant huts began streaming in along the trails. A boy with an abscess on his neck, an old man with a dislocated hip, a woman with a burn from a pot of stew that had fallen over, and another woman from the Red Stone tribe. Tara had sent her. She was pregnant, 8 months along, 29 years old. This was her 4th childbirth. Her previous 3 children had survived. So had the mother. But Tara didn't want to take any chances. She sent the woman to Dan, along with a note on a clay tablet written in Yuna's script. Tara had learned the symbols. Dan was the first person in this world to receive a letter, a real letter, written and delivered. Tara kept it brief. "Take care of her. I'll be on your side at the council." Dan showed the tablet to Yuna. Yuna read it. She looked up. And on her face was an expression that Dan would remember for the rest of his life. Pride. Her symbols were working. Her invention was transmitting thoughts across a distance. 2 days' journey. No voice. No messenger to memorize the words. Clay and scratches, and a thought that arrived intact. Yuna said quietly, "This will remain. When we're gone, this will remain." Dan placed his hand on her shoulder. "Yes, this will remain." He began preparing the lens. It was the most difficult thing he'd ever done in this world. More difficult than surgery, more difficult than childbirth. Because for surgery, he had his hands and his knowledge. For the lens, he needed a material that didn't exist. There was no glass. He couldn't find a transparent crystal that could be cut. That left ice. The idea was simple. Freeze water into the shape of a lens. Pure water. Transparent. No bubbles. The shape had to be convex on both sides, like a drop. He carved a mold out of clay, convex on one side and flat on the other. He poured boiled water into it, strained it through a cloth, and took it out into the frost. The nights were still cold. The water froze. Dan took out the icy disc, cloudy, full of bubbles. No good. He tried again. Different water, different filtration, a different mold. On the 5th try, it worked. An icy lens, the size of a palm, almost transparent, with the right curvature. Dan looked at his finger through it. His finger looked bigger. The lines on his skin were clearly visible. Pores, hairs, dirt under his fingernail. It worked. Not like a microscope, not even close. The magnification was maybe 3 or 4 times, but that should be enough. Because Dan didn't need to show bacteria, He needed to show dirt, to show that the knife used to cut the umbilical cord had things on it that shouldn't be there. Particles of old skin, dried blood, pus, everything the naked eye can't see, but the lens would reveal. He kept the lens in a jar of cold water in the shade. He changed the water every day. The lens melted slowly. He had time, 20 days. That would be enough. Savannah brought the knife on the 14th day. She came at night, just like the first time, shaking, pale, but there was no fear in her eyes. There was fire. A quiet, steady fire that Dan had seen in Nari's eyes, in Tara's eyes, in the eyes of every woman who had made a decision from which there was no turning back. She placed the knife in front of Dan. Copper, tarnished, with a wooden handle wrapped in a leather strap. There were dark spots on the blade, dried blood, or not blood, something dark and oily. Dan picked up the knife carefully, not by the blade, by the handle. He held it up to the fire. He looked. Even without his lens, he could see. The blade was covered with a thin film, organic, brownish. These were the remains of what had been in the ritual bowl, a piece of old skin, water that hadn't been changed, perhaps for years, and the blood of dozens of women in labor, layer upon layer, year after year. A perfect breeding ground for bacteria, warm, moist, nutritious. This knife had killed more women than all the wars in the valley's history combined. And the priests who carried it believed they were carrying a blessing. Dan wrapped the knife in clean leather. He hid it. He turned to Savan. She was standing by the wall, waiting. He said, "Thank you." She replied, "Huaran will find out in the morning. I won't be able to come back." Dan nodded. "You'll stay here." Savan looked at him, then at the hut of the pure hands outside the window, then at her own hands. Then she said quietly, "I don't know who I am now. Not a priestess, not Huaran's apprentice. Who?" Dan replied, "You're Savan. That's enough. We'll figure out the rest." Spring brought news of the tribal council 20 days later. Tara sent support and the first letter in the valley's history, written on a clay tablet. Dan fashioned a magnifying lens out of ice, and Savan stole Huaran's ritual knife. The knife is covered with an organic film that acts as a carrier of infection. The council gathered on the 21st day of spring, a large clearing at the confluence of 3 streams. Dan walked there, counting as he went. He always counted. A doctor's habit. A soldier's habit. He counted the people walking with him. Nari, Yuna, Haeyong, Savan, Mira. 5. 5 women who, over the course of 9 months, had become his family, his team, his reason for being here. Behind them came others. The midwives from Black Otter whom Nari had trained. The women from Grey Heron who had given birth at the hut of Pure Hands. Mothers, living mothers, with living children in their arms. 30 people, maybe more. Dan didn't look back. He looked ahead, at the clearing, at the bonfires already burning, at the people already waiting. The chief sat in a semicircle. Dan counted 12. 12 out of roughly 20 tribes in the valley. The rest hadn't come, too far away, or they didn't want to. Behind each chief stood his tenu, 12 priests, old men in feathers and animal skins, with bowls and staffs and pouches of herbs. Havaran wasn't sitting behind Kelhin. He sat apart, in the center of the semicircle, like a prosecutor, like a judge. He had chosen this spot himself, and no one objected. Because the Tenu had the right to speak on behalf of the spirits, and the spirits do not sit behind the chief's back. The spirits speak to everyone. Tara was here. She was sitting behind her brother, the chief, or rather, next to him. Her brother looked as if he'd spent the night with a jug of honey. Cloudy eyes, a flabby face. Tara, next to him, seemed carved from stone, sharp, composed. She looked at Dan, briefly, with a single glance. I'm here. The council began with rituals. The senior Tennu of the White Stone tribe lit the sacred fire. They chanted a prayer to the Mother River. They splashed water on the stones for Father Fire. They observed a moment of silence for the Nameless One. Dan stood and waited. He knew that the ritual was a framework. Within that framework, a conversation would take place, and that conversation would determine everything. Kvaran spoke first. He had the right to do so. The Tenyu of the Grey Heron, the High Priest, 30 years of service. His voice was steady, calm, convincing. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse, he recounted. He told how, 9 months ago, a stranger had washed ashore by the river, how the stranger had entered the tribe and pushed the Tenyu away from the sick woman, how, since then, the stranger had taken on the work of the spirits, how he washes his hands with water and says there is power in the water, how he had turned the women away from the rituals, that he was teaching them his own rights, that he had built a separate hut and was taking women in labor there, that he had stolen the sacred knife. He said this last part quietly, almost in a whisper, and the entire council shuddered. The sacred knife. Stolen. By a stranger. Dan saw the chief's faces change. The theft of a sacred object in this world was punishable by death. No questions asked. Karin knew what he was doing. He didn't accuse Dan of witchcraft. He didn't call him a demon. He accused him of theft. Specifically. Provably. Deadly. Kelhan sat with a stony expression. He knew about the knife. Dan had warned him. But knowing about it and seeing it used against you are two different things. It was Dan's turn. He stood up, stepped into the center, looked at the 12 chieftains, at the 12 priests, at the hundreds of people standing behind them. He spoke in their language, with an accent, with mistakes, but he spoke. He said he hadn't stolen the knife. He had taken it to reveal the truth. He took the knife out of the bundle, unwrapped it, placed it on the stone in front of him. 12 pairs of the chief's eyes stared at the dark greenish blade. Then Dan took out the lens. He'd kept it in a pot of cold water until the very last moment. It had partially melted. It had become thinner, but it still worked. It was still transparent. He needed 10 minutes. He lifted the lens, turned it toward the sun, placed the knife's blade on the white stone, pressed the lens against the blade, looked, then stepped back, turned to Kelhan. Look! Kelhan stood up, walked over, leaned in. He looked at the blade through the icy lens. Dan saw his face change. Through the lens, the blade revealed what the naked eye couldn't see. Dark clumps, strands, spots of dried blood, fibers of skin, dirt that had accumulated over the years, layer upon layer. Kelhan straightened up. He looked at Dan. Dan said, "They use this knife to cut the umbilical cord. For every woman in labor, in every tribe. They wash this knife in a bowl with a piece of old leather, which hasn't been changed in years. What you see on the blade is dirt. These are the very same tiny evil spirits I told Nari about. They live in this dirt. They enter a woman's body when the umbilical cord is cut with the knife, and 4 days later, the woman dies. Not from the Nameless One, from the dirt on the knife." Silence. Absolute. Not a sound. Even the wind had stopped. Then Dan said, "Everyone, look!" One by one, the chiefs approached and looked. through the icy lens at the blade of the knife used to cut the umbilical cords of their wives, their daughters, their sisters. Some recoiled, some stood there for a long time. One chieftain looked, then turned to his Tennu and said something quiet and terrifying. The Tennu turned pale. Hwadan sat motionless. His face didn't change. He didn't move. He didn't stand up. He didn't scream. He looked at Dan with a steady, heavy gaze. Dan walked over to him, crouched down across from him, held out the lens. Look. Hwadan didn't move. Look, yourself, with your own eyes. Hwadan took the lens, slowly, as if it were burning his fingers. He leaned over the knife. He looked. Dan saw his hands tremble. He saw his eyes widen. He saw sweat break out on his forehead. He saw it. For 30 years, he had carried that knife from one woman in labor to the next. For 30 years, he had washed it in the ritual bowl. For 30 years, he had believed he was carrying a blessing. But he had been carrying death. Hwadan set the lens aside. He raised his head. He looked at Dan. And Dan saw something in his eyes he hadn't expected. Not anger, not denial. Pain. The real, raw, unbearable pain of a man who had just realized he had killed those he had sworn to protect. Hwadan didn't scream. He didn't fall. He didn't beat his chest. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. And he aged 20 years in 10 seconds. Dan stood up. He turned to the council and spoke quietly, so quietly that the chiefs had to lean in to hear him. I am not a shaman. I am not a messenger. I am a man who knows how to wash his hands. And now they know too. At the tribal council, Hwaran accused Dan of stealing the sacred knife. Dan showed the chiefs the dirt on the blade through the ice lens and explained that the knife was a carrier of the infection that kills women in childbirth. Hwaran looked through the lens himself and broke down, realizing that for 30 years he had been bringing death instead of a blessing. Dan didn't finish his speech at the council meeting. He didn't explain any further. He didn't try to prove his point. He didn't try to convince them. He simply stepped back and called out. They emerged from behind him. Nari first, with her back straight and her hands no longer trembling. Yuna, with a clay tablet pressed to her chest. Hae-young, with a broken nose and a gaze that made you want to look away. Sewon, pale and slender, but standing on her own 2 feet rather than behind someone else's back. Mira, small, with a bag of tools slung over her shoulder. Tara, who came from her chieftain's side and stood next to Dan. And behind them, 30 women. Midwives, apprentices, mothers. Each held a simple clay bowl of boiled water in her hands. 30 bowls, 30 pairs of clean hands. 30 women who knew what not a single Tennu in the valley knew: how to keep a mother from dying. The council watched. Dan said, "You can kill me. I won't resist, but the knowledge will remain. It's already in their minds. It's already in their hands. You can't kill knowledge." The silence lasted a long time. Then a man stepped out of the crowd. Dan recognized him immediately. A huge man, a scar across his entire face. The father of the boy with the broken leg. He had come to the council from his own tribe, a 2-day journey. He didn't come as a chief, not as a warrior, as a father whose son had been returned to him. He walked across the clearing, past the chiefs, past the priests, past Kavarin, who sat as still as a stone. He approached Dan, stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just stood there. His brother stood beside him. Then 2 hunters from the Gray Heron. Then an old woman from the distant huts whose wrist Dan had set that winter. Then a man whose neck abscess he had lanced, saving him from blood poisoning. Then a woman from the Black Otter, Hyun's sister, with a scar on her side, alive, walking. Then more, and more, dozens of them. They walked over and stood beside Dan, silently, without words, without speeches. They simply stood there. Hwaran watched this. Then he stood up, slowly, with difficulty. He turned and walked away. Not toward Dan, not toward the chiefs. Away. Down the slope toward the river. No one stopped him. The council watched him go. The eldest of the chiefs raised his hand. He said one word. It was decided. Dan didn't know exactly what had been decided, but from the way Kelthan's shoulders relaxed, he understood. They wouldn't turn him in. They wouldn't kill him. They had accepted him. On the way back to the settlement, Yuna walked beside him, in silence, for a long time. Then she took his hand, openly, in front of everyone, for the first time. Her palm was small and warm and rough with calluses, the palm of a girl who rode on clay, chopped wood, and gathered herbs. She said, "Tanhei, you'll stay now." Not a question, a statement. Dan looked at the valley, at the smoke rising above the huts, at the river glistening below, at the mountains standing all around like the walls of a house, at the people walking behind him and beside him. Nari carrying someone else's child in her arms. Heian walking slightly ahead and checking the trail. Sewon, who was talking to the midwife from Black Otter. Tara, who was counting something in her head and moving her lips. Miru, who was clutching her tool bag close and looking up at him. He looked at Yoon. He nodded. Yes, I think I'm home now. But home didn't mean peace. Home meant work. The first few days after the council were packed to the brim. The chiefs of the 4 tribes asked Dan to send midwives. 4 tribes, all at once. Rumors of the knife spread through the valley like wildfire. Every Tennu returned to their tribe and recounted what they had seen. Dirt on the sacred knife. The lens. A stranger who isn't a shaman but knows what the shamans don't know. The reactions varied. Some Tennu accepted it. They came to Dan on their own. They asked questions. They begged to be taught. An old man from the Gray Bull tribe sat in front of Dan all day and listened. Then he said, "I too washed my knife in the bowl. How many have I killed?" Dan replied, "You didn't know." The old man shook his head. "That's not an answer." Dan looked at him. Then he said, "You're right. That's not an answer. The answer is that now you know, and every woman you save from this day forward is your answer." The old man nodded. He stood up. He washed his hands. The first Tennu in the history of the valley to wash his hands because he understood why. The other Tennu didn't accept it. 3 priests from distant tribes refused to listen. They declared Dan an enemy of the spirits. They closed their settlements. They forbade the midwives from learning. Dan didn't go to them. He didn't try to convince them. He told Nari, "We'll wait. In a season, their women will die and ours will live. And they'll come on their own, or their midwives will come in secret." Nari nodded. She had already seen this. In Black Otter, the midwives had come to her before the Tennu allowed it. Because the midwives buried the mothers, while the Tennu only sang over the graves. Hwaran had disappeared. After the council, he didn't return to the Gray Heron settlement. He didn't come to his hut. He didn't collect his things. He simply went down to the river and didn't come back. Kelhan sent hunters to look for him. They found him on the 3rd day, on the riverbank, alive. He was sitting on a rock, staring at the water. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't drunk. He hadn't spoken. The hunters left him some food and left. Dan wanted to go to him. Nari stopped him. She said, "Not now." Give him time. He's lost everything. Not just power, meaning. For 30 years, he believed he served the spirits, that his hands brought healing, that his knife was blessed. And now he knows his hands brought death. That's not something that can be healed in 3 days. Dan listened, because Nari was right, and because he had too much work to do to chase after a broken old man. At the council, dozens of people he had saved stood up for Dan, and the chiefs accepted him. Huarun went down to the river and did not return to the settlement. The 4 tribes requested midwives trained in the ways of the pure hands. Some of the Tennu accepted the new knowledge, while others refused. A year passed, then a second. Dan kept track of time by the seasons. 2 rainy seasons, 2 winters, 2 summers, over 700 notches on the wall of his hut. The valley had changed, not quickly, slowly, like a river changing its course, imperceptible if you look at it every day, obvious when compared to how it used to be. In the Gray Heron tribe, not a single woman in labor died during the 2nd year. In the Black Otter tribe, 1 did, a difficult birth, twins. The midwife did everything right. Her hands were clean, the water was boiled, the knife was sterilized. But the first baby had the umbilical cord wrapped around its neck. It died. The mother survived. The second baby survived. Dan found out and sat in silence all evening. Nari sat beside him. She didn't offer comfort. She knew what he knew. You can't save everyone, but you can save many. In Redstone, Terra launched a program that Dan privately referred to as a sanitation reform. The outhouses were moved downstream from the water source. Trash began to be buried. The skins used for the sick were washed separately. Terra didn't do this through persuasion, through orders. She ruled the tribe with an iron fist, and by this time, her brother, the chief, had almost completely handed over the reins to her. Unofficially. Formally, he was the chief. In reality, Terra made all the decisions. Dan came to Redstone every 2 months. He and Terra would sit in her hut and discuss matters. Salt supplies, trade routes, training new midwives, building a second hut of clean hands. These were conversations between equals, 2 adults working toward a common goal. Once, in the middle of a discussion about jerky deliveries, Terra fell silent. Dan looked up. She was looking at him, and in her eyes was something he hadn't seen before. Tenderness. Not weakness. Tenderness. Like a warm stone in the sun. Hard, but warm. She said, if you'd been here back then, 7 years ago, she would still be alive. Dan knew who she was talking about the daughter she'd lost during childbirth. He said, maybe, or maybe not. I'm not God, Terra. I'm a man who knows just a little more. Terra looked at him. Then she nodded. Then she turned away, and he saw a single tear slide down her cheek. Just one. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, quickly, roughly, as if she were wiping away not a tear, but a weakness. Then she turned back and continued the conversation about jerky. But something had changed. Between them, in the air, in the way she handed him the bowl of broth, in the way she touched his hand as she pointed out a new trail on the map drawn on the ground. Gently, with her fingertips. Dan noticed. He wasn't blind, but he didn't rush her, because Terra was the kind of person who had to come around on her own. Yuna had grown up, 18 years old, then 19. She was no longer the girl who asked questions. She was the woman who found answers. Her writing system had spread to 4 tribes. Midwives wrote down the rules for clean hands on clay tablets and passed them on. Yuna taught the children. It was the first school in the valley's history. 10 children sat before her every day and learned to scratch symbols into the clay. She beamed. Kelhan no longer spoke of marrying her off to the chief of a neighboring tribe. Not because he changed his mind, because Yuna herself had gone to her father and said she wouldn't go. Kelhan argued. Yuna didn't argue. She simply said no. And Kelhan saw in her eyes what Dan had seen 2 years earlier. Fire. A steady, quiet, unquenchable fire. He backed down. Yuna came to Dan that evening. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't ask for advice. She came and said, "I've made my choice. On my own." Dan looked at her, at the young, grown woman with calluses on her fingers and clay dust in her hair. He said, "I know." Haeyeon had become the commander of the Clean Hands Hut's security detail. Not officially. No such position existed. But the 5 young hunters who, for various reasons, had ended up alongside Dan, obeyed her as their leader. She taught them what she knew: trails, tracks, ambushes, reconnaissance. And she also taught them something new: first aid, stopping bleeding, splinting a fracture, bandaging. She'd learned this from Dan and passed it on. Combat medics, the first in history. Dan had once stitched up a cut on her eyebrow, a new one. She'd gotten into a fight with one of the hunters from a neighboring tribe. They couldn't agree on who would use the ford. She came to the hut of Clean Hands with blood on her face and a furious expression. Dan sat her down on the cot. He washed her hands. He took out a needle and thread. He stitched carefully, with small stitches. She sat motionless. She didn't flinch. He muttered, "Sit still, you monster." Haeyoung snorted. Then she laughed, quietly, hoarsely, like someone whose laughter had rusted from disuse. It was the first joke directed at her in years that didn't hurt. Peace. She had turned 16. She talked, a lot and fast, as if she were making up for those months of silence. She knew all the rules of Clean Hands, knew all the herbs, knew how to stitch a wound, how to set a dislocation, and how to deliver a baby. She assisted Dan in every operation. Her hands were precise and quick. Dan looked at her and saw a doctor, a real one, not a midwife who had memorized a set of rules, a doctor who understood why the rules worked. She asked questions like Yuna, but different ones. Yuna asked why. Mira asked how. How to stop the bleeding if a tourniquet doesn't work. How to tell if a bone is broken if there's no wound. How to identify poisoning by smell. Practical questions, specific ones. She thought like a doctor. Dan taught her everything, every last bit. Every evening he sat with her and explained about the body, about blood, about bones, about muscles, about organs. He drew on clay. The heart, the lungs, the liver, the intestines. Mira memorized it all the first time. She recorded everything using Yuna's system, clay tablets, dozens of them. The first medical textbook in the history of the world, written by a 16-year-old girl with scars on her soul and the hands of a surgeon. Toward the end of the second year, Dan began to build the House of Clean Hands. Not a hut, a house. The first permanent building in the valley built for medical treatment. Stone, clay, wooden beams, 4 rooms, one for women in labor, one for the sick, one for instruments and supplies, one for students. The whole tribe helped build it. Kelhan sent people. Tara sent materials. The father of the boy with the broken leg came himself and worked in silence for 12 days. When the walls went up, the roof was put on, and smoke began to rise from the hearths, Dan stood at the entrance and watched. Nari stood beside him. She was watching too. Then she said quietly, "You built this." Dan shook his head. "We built it." Nari looked at him, then at her hands. Clean hands. Hands that no longer killed. Hands that saved. 40 names, she said. I remember all 40. Dan nodded. I know. Nari said, now I have another list, a longer one, a list of the living. She didn't smile. Nari rarely smiled, but her voice was such that Dan felt something warm rise in his chest. Not joy, not pride, gratitude. For her being there, for being the first to believe, for being the first to wash her hands. That night, Nari didn't leave. She stayed. She just stayed. She lay down beside him, and they both realized that this had happened a long time ago, long before that night, on the day she sat down across from him and said, "Teach me." Over the course of 2 years, the clean hand system spread to most of the tribes in the valley. Tara carried out a public health reform in Redstone. Yuna founded the first school of writing. Mira became a fully qualified doctor and began writing a medical textbook on clay tablets. Dan built the House of Clean Hands, and Nari stayed with him. The third spring, Dan sat on the riverbank and looked out at the water. The very same river where he had been found, the Mother River. It carried murky spring water down the valley, past the huts, past the fields, past the House of Clean Hands, which stood on a hill, smoke rising from its 4 hearths, past the children running along the bank and shouting. Dozens of children. Living, healthy, boisterous children. 2 years ago, there were half as many. Dan had been counting. He always counted. In the 2.5 years since the tribes had adopted the rules of clean hands, 123 children had been born. 4 mothers had died in childbirth. 4 out of 123. Before, 1 in 3 died. 1 in 4. 4 out of 123. That was a victory. A quiet, inconspicuous statistical victory that didn't look like a victory. Because 4 women had died anyway. And Dan remembered each one. Just as Nari remembered her 40 names. He had his own list, a shorter one, but it wasn't any easier. Mira was sitting next to him, 16 years old. She'd grown over the past 2 years. She'd shot up, skinny, wiry, quick, with attentive brown eyes that noticed everything. She no longer carried his bag. She had her own, her very own, with her own tools. Bone needles she'd sharpened herself, suture threads she'd prepared herself, herbs she'd gathered and dried herself. She was a doctor, not an apprentice, not an assistant, a doctor. A week ago, she'd delivered a baby on her own, without Dan, without Nari, all by herself, in a remote hut on the western slope. A difficult delivery, a breech presentation. Mira managed it. The mother is alive. The baby is alive. When she returned and told Dan, he listened and nodded and asked questions. And inside, something was both aching and glowing at the same time. Pride, fear, joy, the realization that she no longer needed him. Mira sat next to him on the riverbank, skipping pebbles across the water. She said, "Tanhei." He turned around. She was looking at the river, not at him. She said, "I remember." He waited. She said, "I remember when Mom died. She got sick. She coughed. Then she lay there and didn't get up. Dad brought her water. Then Dad got sick too. I brought water to both of them. Then Mom stopped breathing. I held her hand. It was hot, then cold. Dad stood up. He walked to the door. He fell. I couldn't lift him. He was heavy. I sat down next to him. I sat there for a long time. Then he stopped breathing too. I covered Mom with the animal skins. All of them. So she wouldn't be cold. Then I hid in the corner. Then you came in. She spoke calmly, without tears, without a tremor in her voice, like someone who had found the words for what she'd been carrying inside for 2 years, and spoken them, and let them go. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. He just listened. When she finished, he said, "You tried to help. You carried water. You held Mom's hand. You covered her up. You were 12 years old, and you did everything you could." Mira looked at him. Then she nodded. Then she said, "That's why I want to know everything. Everything you know, so I'll never have to stand by and not be able to help again." Dan placed his hand on her head, a heavy, warm hand. She didn't pull away. She leaned against his shoulder, and they sat like that, in silence, on the riverbank. Father and daughter, not by blood, by choice, by something stronger than blood. Later that day, Dan walked around the House of Clean Hands. 4 rooms. Each one was in use. In the delivery room, a woman in her 8th month lay on the bed. Nari sat beside her. They were talking, calmly, like friends. Nari held her hand and explained what would happen, how the birth would go, what to do, what not to be afraid of. Nari's voice was warm and steady, the voice of someone who is no longer afraid. In the sick room, Savan was brewing a decoction of willow bark. She had found her place, not a priestess, not a midwife, a healer. She combined what she had learned from Huaran with what she had learned from Dan, herbs and purity, ritual and knowledge. She spoke to the sick in a language they understood, the language of spirits and ancestors. But behind the words lay real healing, clean hands, boiled water, and decoctions that actually worked. 6 people sat in the students' room, 4 women and 2 men. One of the men was a hunter whose shattered foot Dan had amputated a year ago after a rock had fallen on him. He could no longer hunt. Dan gave him something else. He gave him hands, hands that knew how to stitch, set bones, and bandage. The first male apprentice. The first man in the valley to enter the birthing hut, not as a father, but as an assistant. It was a breach of all traditions, and it worked. Yuna stood before them with a clay tablet and explained. Symbols, rules, records. She taught them to read and write, because a doctor who cannot write down what he knows will take that knowledge with him to the grave. But a doctor who writes it down will leave it behind forever. Dan stood in the doorway and watched it all. Nari with the woman in labor, Saiwan with the herbal decoctions, at Yuna with her tablets, at the students who were diligently scribbling symbols, at Haeyoung who stood outside the entrance watching the path, keeping watch, as always. At Mira, who had gone to the hut in the distance because an old man was sick there and she'd decided she could handle it on her own. She'd manage. Dan knew it. At Tara, who had come from Redstone to discuss the construction of the second house of clean hands. Back home, in her own tribe. And he thought, if I were to disappear tomorrow, if I were no longer here, what would remain? Nari would continue to deliver babies. Savan will continue to heal. Yuna will continue to teach. Mira will continue everything. Haeyoung will continue to protect. Tara will continue to build. Students will become teachers. Their students will become teachers. The rules of clean hands will be carved in stone. The clay tablets will outlive him by thousands of years. Knowledge will remain. Not his name, not his face, not his story. Knowledge. The habit of washing one's hands. The habit of boiling water. The habit of believing that every life is worth fighting for. In 100 years, no one will remember Tanhei. In 200, they'll forget where the rules came from. In 1,000, a midwife will wash her hands before a birth and not know why. It's just what they do. It's what they've always done. It's the right thing to do. And that was exactly what he wanted. His quiet, personal goal, never spoken aloud to anyone. To leave behind not a cult, but a habit. Not a name, but knowledge. Not a memory of himself, but the lives of those who would come after. That evening, he sat by the hearth in the House of Clean Hands. Nari was beside him. Yuna was across from him. Haeyoung was by the wall. Sewon was by the pot of herbal tea. Mira pressed herself against his side and read her notes. Tara sat slightly to the side and watched the fire. Silence. A warm, living silence, full of breath and presence. The silence of people who don't need words to be together. Dan watched the fire. Father Fire. That's what they called him here. He didn't believe in Fire Father. He didn't believe in the ancestral Mother River. He didn't believe in the Nameless One. He believed in boiled water, in clean hands, in the fact that a person who knows just a little more has a duty to teach, and in the fact that these 6 women by his side were the best thing he'd ever done in both of his lives. He hadn't saved the world. He didn't slay a dragon. He didn't become king. He taught people to wash their hands, and that was enough. Beyond the walls of the House of Clean Hands, the river roared. The river mother carried water through the valley, past the huts where living mothers and their living children slept, past the fields where barley would grow in the spring, past the paths along which midwives would walk, carrying pouches of ash and knowledge in their heads, past the stones on which the 10 rules would be carved, past the future that Dan would never see, but which would exist because once a weary man with dirty hands said one word to a woman clad in animal skins. Mine. Mira looked up from her notes. She looked at him. She said, "Tanhei, what are we going to do tomorrow?" Dan looked at her, at his daughter, at his legacy, at the doctor who was 16 years old and had her whole life ahead of her, in which she would save more people than he ever had. He said, "Tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll teach."